either Europe or Asia, good morning if you're elsewhere, or good afternoon. I would like to welcome you to our third and final session of the climate talks, which we have been having over the past week in the summer. This final session will be about climate finance, but maybe it's good for me to reflect back a little bit on the previous two ones, in which we reflected on a few topics related to climate change. The first one that you might have missed, but which you can, of course, always listen back because we record all the sessions, is the one on climate change and gender inequality. So how does climate change impact women particularly? We concluded in that session that it's mainly women that are impacted most or hardest, and that they should also be part of the solution against climate change. In the second session, which was 2 weeks ago, which you can also listen back, we talked about how to avoid, reduce, and address climate change. And different solutions were offered. And that one was maybe the most saying of the topic we're going to discuss today. If we have so many ideas on how to address climate change, avoid and mitigate, what does it mean for financing? How are we going to make sure we can allocate sufficient money? How do we ensure that the money also gets where it's supposed to be with the right people? And also, of course, the amount. How much do we need? Who pays for it and who doesn't pay for it? So I would like to welcome everybody online and physically. I'd also like to introduce the way we host these webinars. It's a hybrid webinar, which means that we have people physically present with us whom can ask questions, but also live interact with us. And we, of course, also have quite some viewers online. I would like to also invite people online to ask questions if you have any. To do so, please find our comment section in Zoom. There you can pose your question, and then my colleagues will redirect the question to me, and then I can pose it to the speakers of today. The same goes for the people that are physically here. We have a special stand set up where you can stand up and pose your question to any of our speakers, and we'll also make sure that they answer that one. Without too much more information, I would like to let you know that we have a nice group of speakers today. One is here with me. I'll introduce him in a minute. But we also have two renowned speakers online. I would like to start with Sindra Sharma, and she is from Can Europe, a policy advisor, and she has worked on climate finance, done quite some research on this. She also focuses in the climate area on the small island states, of course, of whom we know that have faced quite some issues with regards to climate change. She has also been one of the advisors of the President-Chief of COP23, which is also, of course, very impressive. And we welcome you, Sindra. I'll give you a minute or 5 minutes to maybe introduce yourself and tell us a little bit more about climate finance. What does it mean? How does that look? Please go ahead before, maybe I'll introduce shortly all the other speakers, and then I'll give you 5 minutes to start. The second speaker we have today is Professor Mizan Khan. He is joining us all the way from Bangladesh. So we're honored that he's doing that today because it's quite late over there. He has a resume that is quite impressive. He has a PhD in environmental policy and development. He's also the Deputy Director of International Center of Climate Change and Development in Bangladesh. He's the lead author of the IPCC reports, and he almost every year, I think even if not every year, attends the COP negotiations on behalf of Bangladesh. So I think here we would be able to ask him quite some questions where he can enlighten us on quite interesting things on what that looks like when you are part of the climate negotiations. Our third and not least speaker is here today with us in the physical sense. His name is Ferko Bodnar. He's from the Dutch, not really from the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs. He works for the Policy, Operation and Evaluation Department. They're officially part of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, but it's good for me to highlight that they're independent and not aligned with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So they do different evaluation on policies. He has been part of evaluations on sustainable trade initiatives, Dutch food security policies, policy coherence of Dutch policies and the effects of food security, water and climate. And today he's going to talk to us about his evaluation of climate finance. As you can hear, we have quite an impressive panel of people to have a conversation with today. It's going to be dynamic. I will give them space to give us some information on their work. And then throughout the conversation of the night, we'll have some questions either from the audience online or physically or from myself. But I also invite our speakers to engage with each other and if needed, ask each other questions. Sindra, I would like to come back to you with the question, what is climate finance? Can you enlighten us a little bit? And why is that so important, particularly also after having talked about we need to reduce, avoid, and mitigate everything with regards to climate change, but we need the money?
Thank you very much. That's quite a question. So let me get straight into it. So looking at why climate finance is so important. So because to come anywhere close to the sort of transformational and systemic transition we need to see to remain in a climate safe world, those who have historically contributed the most to this issue will need to help facilitate this transition for those who have contributed the least historically. So it is a reaction to historical and ongoing injustice. So as you could imagine, climate finance has always been a key element of climate negotiations since 1992. However, now I think it's most often associated with the target of mobilizing 100 billion a year by 2020 by developed countries for developing countries. And this target was first agreed at COP15 back in 2009 and then expanded on in 2010 in the what's known as the Cancun agreements, whereby the Green Climate Fund was established, and this was established to act as a key delivery mechanism for climate finance. And since then, it has been strengthened and reinforced in subsequent climate conferences, with COP21 seeing parties decide that this target would need to be balanced between mitigation and adaptation, and it will need to be reassessed and raised after 2025 to set a new collective quantified goal, which is known as the tongue twister of NCQG, and raised from a floor of 100 billion per year, taking into account needs and priorities of developing countries as well. So in order to do this at COP26, parties established an ad hoc work program from 2022 to 2024 to inform this new goal. And these discussions are ongoing, so they'll be ongoing till 2024. And meanwhile, the US 100 billion target has become this sort of political focal point for further discussions around many aspects of climate change related finance, and particularly those related to developing countries. And it's become an issue of trust, with a continued inability to deliver this finance in a timely manner, in a timely and balanced and transparent manner, eroding trust within the multilateral process as well. And the addition of flows is highly, like the quantification and addition of flows is highly questionable, as well as lending models like loans are debt driving instruments. So not all mechanisms for climate finance are equal as others, and grant-based finance is the key. The IPCC says that an annual investment of 2.4 trillion is needed in the energy system alone until 2035, just to reach that 1.5 degrees target. And while adaptation is really difficult to quantify, but the adaptation gap report noted that 140 to 300 billion will be needed by 2030 for adaptation needs. And again, I stress that this is an underestimate. Now, if we contrasted this with the reality, The IMF has recently shown that fossil fuel subsidies were 5.9 trillion, or 6.8% of global GDP in 2020. And this is expected to increase to 7.4% of GDP in 2025. So when we need to be coming out of these subsidies, they're still increasing. And the finance agenda, as we know it today, spans mitigation and adaptation. And within the world of loss and damage, these can be seen as related to averting and minimizing loss and damage. However, a critical arm of finance that developing country blocks and also CSOs are pushing to see in the new collective quantified goal is addressing loss and damage as the third pillar of climate finance. So right now we have imperfect finance for mitigation and adaptation, but we have absolutely no finance to address loss and damage. And this is what is left when inaction and mitigation sees the limits of adaptation being reached, and communities are therefore bearing the brunt of loss and damage, which can be economic and also non-economic in nature. And this refers to things like the loss of culture, community, language, identity. And if climate finance is contentious, then finance to address loss and damage is like the black hole of climate finance. Developed countries do not want to be moving on addressing loss and damage in a manner that is needs-based, scaled, justice-oriented, and new and additional. And at COP26, Climate Action Network made finance to address loss and damage the litmus test for success. And we heard negotiating blocs constituting the majority of the world, like G77 and China, asking for a loss and damage finance facility. This did not ensue at COP26. However, the expectation from these major developing country blocs was for such a facility to be established. So in the forthcoming COPs. So maybe very briefly, like a minute on why this is a contentious issue. At its heart, loss and damage is an unsettling moral failure and a deep injustice. And the recent IPCC impacts report, which came out earlier this year, shows that we are in the era of loss and damage. And it's contentious because for wealthy nations, they see that it can be about reparations, liability, and beyond this, there are questions on how do you compensate for non-economic loss and damage and the significant human costs associated with it. So while developing countries did not use the terms reparation, compensation, and liability in the negotiations, and have asked for more of a cooperative approach based on solidarity, wealthy nations have tended to block these conversations of finance until it became a key issue at COP26 in Glasgow, and then from there we've seen it sort of spiral forward a bit. So the broader justice perspective is really integral to loss and damage finance, and in many ways, the multilateral climate regime is sometimes built upon these perhaps neo-colonial principles, which were not really fit for purpose when addressing this need of climate finance. And they uphold old ways of maybe doing and being, and continue to maybe maintain a status quo, which deepens inequality on the back of compounding crisis. And a rights-based approach is fundamental to understanding loss and damage finance. And when we see this through a lens, you begin to understand the extent of human rights obligations, which are maybe violated by a failure to act on addressing loss and damage. So this is a long way of saying why we need a loss and damage finance facility, and also why climate finance is important, and all three pillars of climate finance is important.
Thank you very much. I think it was quite elaborate and also interesting to hear your reasoning on indeed the money that is available for mainly adaptation and mitigation, and how loss and damage is basically fallen off the wagon, while it's one of the most important ones as well, next to the other two. Maybe for my understanding and also for the public, if we talk about such a loss and damage facility, how would that look like? What would we expect from such a facility? And also it has been in a part of the negotiations for so many years. how can we make sure that it's not just a part of a conversation, but this facility also makes its way and also gets realized because it's so needed?
Thank you. I muted myself. So thank you. Another big question. So we've actually done a lot of thinking around what this facility could look like, because there are many technical aspects to it as well, right? To ensure that it's not just thrown together and that it has the principles that it needs to be really needs-based and justice-oriented and, rights-based. So in order to do that, I think the facility would need to sit under the UNFCCC and under the financial mechanism as well. And therefore it could address those three arms. So it will be looking at addressing loss and damage specifically, and flows can go through there. And it needs to be grant-based as well. I could give a more detailed answer, but I think it could be quite technical, but ultimately the principles would be around international cooperation, solidarity, new and additional, needs-based, predictable, and precautionary. It needs to be locally driven, from local context and needs, and responsive and equitable, and public and grant-based. It can't lead to more debt for countries, and also balanced and comprehensive. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I would like to continue on to hear a little bit from Professor Khan. Of course, with your experience, Professor, if you're already with us, I would like to hear what you have experienced also in terms of not just from the Bangladesh perspective, negotiating as part of the delegation to the different COPs with Bangladesh. How does it look? What does it mean for a country like Bangladesh when we're talking about climate finance? Can you maybe already in your story touch upon some examples of projects where the money allocated for climate adaptation, mitigation is already going to within Bangladesh?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, moderator. Yeah, already Sindra has given an excellent brief on the international dynamics of climate finance. But as a long-time negotiator, I will touch upon few issues from the global perspective, which she did not touch. I won't repeat. So we all know that climate finance, kind of as a category, reflects the political, social, economic, and ecological dynamics of a neoliberal, globalized world. And so what we see kind of a post-Paris dispensation is reflected or characterized by kind of a neglect of distributive justice globally, which was the guiding principle when the climate regime was established, and the promotion of kind of rational self-interest under this neoliberal market justice, which kind of de-emphasizes public responsibility, and private sector and markets are expected to take the lead in solving the global problems. And here we don't find the application of the polluter pays principle, which should have been and still is the cardinal solution to climate change problem. But that is not there because of the world we live in, an unequal, unjust world we live in. Just let me give another example that Sindra did not mention, is about the relationship between climate finance and ODA. development assistance is kind of enlightened charity. It depends on the political expediency or political conditions, economic conditions of the donor countries. So we can say not much about that. But climate finance is our right, and that has been agreed. It's an obligatory responsibility on the part of the developed countries, and that has been agreed well in Climate Convention as well as in the Paris Agreement, with the language shall provide. But the reality is totally different. This is now, if you there is not much difference for many countries between climate finance and ODA. ODA, the mission of ODA was and still is different, and climate finance is meant for addressing climate impacts. But now a dilution of that, and the double injustice happens when climate overall global ODA goes up, goes down, but climate finance goes a little up. So what is happening here? A repackaging of development aid as climate finance, because the development partners have an interest in inflating the figure of climate finance because they are pledge bound to provide. That is why we see over-reporting, double and triple counting. Sindra, I think, has referred also to the Oxfam report versus the OECD claim. Here is a Himalayan gulf between the claim delivery and the actual receipt on the ground. And this gulf is going up and up. And that is where lies the main problem of trust. This is one thing. And for the last quarter of a century, we could not agree to what climate finance is, or the basic criteria that what dollars can we count as climate finance, because then there's wiggle room for self-interpretation of the dollars given either as ODA or even as export credits cannot be termed as climate finance. This is one. Another aspect I want to mention of the injustice. Yes.
Can you maybe also before you continue, because we would also like to make sure our audience can follow ODA. Would you like to maybe elaborate a little bit on what that means? Because it's a term that is known by many, but maybe not by all, which is also very important in terms of climate finance.
Okay, yeah. Overseas development assistance is kind of development aid on the part of the development partners or on the part of the OECD countries. And since 1970, there has been a gentleman's agreement that 0.7% of the gross national income of those countries will be given as development aid for basic provisions in the developed and less developed countries. So climate finance and development aid, the missions are totally different. The difference is blurred now because, in fact, there is not much difference between adaptation and development. You cannot differentiate always. We agree. But then climate finance pot and ODA, development aid pot, should be kept separate, to my argument. And when implementation at the ground level, those two pots can be mixed. So this is what development aid is, but it's going down globally. Okay, and let me continue.
Yes, please.
And another aspect that I wanted to focus on is neglect of locally led adaptation. Adaptation is inherently local and regional because climate impacts have landfall on some specific place. But still climate management or governance of climate finance or adaptation finance is centralized, even globally as well as nationally. So the poor people remain where they are. The money does not flow where it is needed most, not in some terms of within a community, but in globally. For example, half of the LDC countries from Africa did not get any adaptation finance. So this is kind of, as I mentioned, we live in a neoliberal globalized world where market justice, dominates. And market justice, the poor, the vulnerable, do not have the power of markets. So they are bypassed. This is internationally. At national level also, in most of the developing countries, this delivery of adaptation finance even is centralized, where the poor people, victims, real victims, and the women are not getting it. IIED and some other organizations have shown that less than 10%, 5-6% of the whole adaptation money goes to the local level, and 3 to 4% of that money women can handle. So this is where global community needs to focus on. That climate finance agenda must be kind of set by the most vulnerable countries and communities if we want to have kind of a robust adaptation and loss and damage that Sindra has mentioned about. Now, loss and damage is coming in a big way. At the SB session in Bonn just last month, I was there in June, where the G77 countries had been one. And for the last 2-3 years, they are speaking with one voice. And finally, the COP leadership has agreed to have loss and damage finance as a specific agenda at the COP27. And we are very happy about it, because still developed countries want to still continue subsuming loss and damage under adaptation. But our argument is loss and damage is the third pillar. And still, so far, the economic instrumental rationality, what I call, focusing on money and self-interest, did not allow much money for loss and damage. So I am writing a piece on kind of putting a lens of moral and ethical lens to look at loss and damage, because money is not coming, and vaccine nationalism has shown us that money will not come, because we live in absolutely in a world where this rational actor model dominates for countries, pursuit of self-interest. Even you see where climate impacts have got mutuality of interest. Addressing climate change got mutuality of interest both for developed and developing countries. But there we find the Sindra has mentioned about the loan versus grant. 80% of the even adaptation money comes as loans. This is absolute injustice, and this is creating kind of a new climate debt trap. Already these developing countries are in serious trouble of indebtedness, and that was kind of exacerbated by pandemic COVID-19 for the last 3 years. So LDC countries now get adaptation finance, climate finance as 20% of loans. This is kind of, I cannot think of the level of injustice that I am not sure how we can in international negotiations, how we can overcome this kind of injustice. And this is why I argue that it is the youth, it is the young citizens, young voters, particularly of developed countries, who need to be sensitized first. Because in developed countries, politicians usually have to listen to the voice of the ground because they want to get re-elected. And in developing countries, democracies are not very mature yet. So politicians may not care about. But in developed countries, if the young generation gets very, very active and with a cosmopolitan perspective, with a perspective of their kind of responsibility globally, then I think developed countries will come to some kind of better appreciation of the needs of developing countries. Okay.
Thank you very much, Professor Khan. I'll come back a little bit later with a few questions on quite some interesting points you made, whether it's on the debt trap or the youth, of course, being part of the solutions, and not just in the southern countries, but also here in the global north. I would like to move on to Ferko. You're, of course, here with me in the Netherlands. We are now in Utrecht. I don't know if everybody knows this city, but we're basically in the center of the Netherlands. But I would like to really look at the northern part. Of course, the Netherlands is also part of what we call the global north. We also have a footprint of this issue of climate change, which we cannot hide behind, which is quite problematic, if I may call it that. What did your research find? Can you maybe elaborate a little bit on what the Netherlands has been doing to allocate money and redirect money to where it's supposed to be to address climate change?
Yes, thanks for the invitation also. Yes, we finalized this study last year, and we looked actually at three main questions. One was, where does the money actually go to, the money that we consider climate finance, Dutch climate finance, to which countries, to what activities? And the second one was, if we blend public with private finance through loans or public-private partnerships, where does that then go to, and how additional is this to what companies or others would have done even without ODA being blended in it? Maybe. And the third one was this.
Yeah, in between, also in terms of us being able to follow, it's good if you explain a little bit on what is public funding and what is private funding. Yes.
So the public funding, and that's where the others have already commented on it, actually the Dutch climate finance is completely taken from ODA, from development aid, except in 2010, I think it was, with Koenders then, there was the 0.7 ODA, and on top of that, there was a bit of money for climate and environment. But after that, not just the Netherlands, all developed countries did that. They basically decided to take it from the ODA budget. I think Luxembourg and Norway are a bit above that though. So yes, it is, the climate finance is taken from ODA, public funds. Part, maybe about a quarter of Dutch climate finance is used to mobilize private finance or commercial finance. And that can be done, for example, by making a soft loan. For example, FMO is a development bank in the Netherlands, and they give out loans, soft loans, for investments in solar energy in Burkina Faso, for example. I know that project by coincidence. So it is commercially attractive, but not yet attractive enough for the private sector to step in at once. It would be the first one in Burkina Faso, nobody really dared it. And then by having FMO, some additional soft loans and some grants, temporary, they can actually mobilize private finance with public finance. And that way, the Netherlands then sort of claims to have more climate finance. So if you look at the ODA part, that is a certain amount, but they have then also, they also report on part separately what is mobilized from private or commercial finance. So our main question was, is this private or commercial finance, would that not have happened without the ODA? Because otherwise, so if that's not the case, then it's not additional. And the third question was actually, well, what should the future of climate finance look like? And that's where we as three researchers, me and two colleagues, we could actually think of, okay, if there is a next cabinet, next government, Dutch government, with modest ambitions, we hope that they do this and this. If they're very ambitious, depends also on which political parties are in there, then they should really aim at this. So that's the sort of the three sections we looked at.
It sounds very good. Could you maybe also reflect a little bit on, you're talking about public financing, and of course, I heard Professor Khan already saying, no, it shouldn't come from there. Maybe also thinking about the middle or high perspective you would see, where would that fit in? Also reflecting on that question of public finance.
Yeah. I see the point that especially the poorer countries and the poorer population in these countries, and here I'm thinking of people that need to be protected from floods, for example, there's not really a commercial profitable business in there. So you can only support that from grant money. Whereas in renewable energy, it is a bit different. And I can see the point that it has an advantage to use public ODA to mobilize private ODA, think pension funds or pension schemes, just to have more money available to be invested in renewable energy. So I'm not against the mixing of public and private finance. We should be honest about it. But I can see that it is only suitable for certain activities, and also it is only suitable for a certain phase. So at some stage, there's no more need for ODA. Private finance, private companies can pay themselves. So it's a bit of a delicate issue, this blended public-private finance.
Yeah, I would like to reflect a little bit later with Professor Khan on what he thinks on this idea, but maybe you can also share some conclusions with us. What do the numbers look like in the Netherlands? What did you find?
Yeah. So if I look at the reach, and that has to do with how climate finance is actually taken from ODA. Dutch development aid had like four priority areas, but that included agriculture, food security, and water. So if some of these activities, agriculture projects become, let's say, climate smart because you work on irrigation, or water projects, they're also good for climate adaptation because they build dikes, for example, somewhere. That then gets a climate marker. So that is then also the reason why quite a large share of Dutch climate finance is actually spent on climate adaptation, because these were agriculture and water projects in the first place. That's one conclusion. The other conclusion is that this blending of public and private finance, we've seen good examples where it works, where you have a temporary public finance, and then after that, private companies and private banks come in. If I think of this solar panel park in Burkina, for example, because FMO helped set up regulations that the private sector couldn't do, and they have access to this government to discuss these things. But we've also seen examples where more the public-private partnerships, where companies put in a bit of money, 50%, there's 50% ODA, but it never becomes a viable business. So after the end of the project, it stops. It doesn't really, and that's not the idea. It should be a temporary measure for something that then becomes profitable. And I've seen examples where that was not the case. You can keep on funding it forever.
Yeah, thank you. I see we have a question from the live audience. I would like to give you the floor, and then maybe state also who you would like to ask the question to. Go ahead.
Hello. So I would like to ask a question to the three of you, because you are talking about the hybridization of public and private finance. But I'm going to be a little bit of a devil's advocate. But don't you think such a financial construction of public-private finance is indicative of this neoliberal market justice Professor Khan just mentioned, because it might further entrench financial servitude and debt burdens and global debt bondage, in which international development banks give out loans to low-income countries, and then all these multinational corporations and maybe also national companies come in to acquire their resource base, basically, and to gain access to it. And then there is a debt burden, and there's no prospect of debt restructuring or debt cancellation, and then it also reproduces this quagmire of neocolonial power relations, power asymmetries.
So are we basically repeating what we have done under the colonial times by having this kinds of structures of financing where you put people in more and more debt? Well, they already have enough debts.
Yeah. There are various interesting points in this. I visited Mozambique. We had visited Bangladesh as well, and now recently visited Mozambique. And there you had these cyclones in 2019 and a few afterwards. And in a way, I was also surprised to see that the World Bank is giving out loans to the government to repair things. You know, because there, the government, well, first of all, I think it should be paid from grants, or even better from a sort of loss and damage fund, although I know very little about that. But there's not a commercial prospect to pay back that fund. But that is different from certain forms of blended finance actually goes to companies. For example, FMO working with a company that wants to invest in renewable energy. There I can see that it makes sense because there is a commercial prospect, but there's a sort of a temporary barrier that needs to be overcome. The high risk portion of a larger debt, or building on the enabling environment, setting up regulations in a country so that private investors can step in. So there are different cases there. Another aspect that you mentioned, I haven't seen that much with climate finance, but with other development aid, is you need to be careful when you use public funds with private funds that you don't privilege certain companies. I've seen, but that is more on another evaluation I looked at. I'll be very brief. Yeah. In the cocoa sector in West Africa, for example, some work was done in what they call the pre-competitive space. So all would benefit, setting a standard, developing, I don't know, a code. But some activities were actually privileging particular companies who would then compete with other companies that didn't have this ODA support. We should really avoid that. No.
Thank you. I would like to go back online and maybe also give Sindra some time to reflect on this question from our audience. So how do you feel about these new ways in which indeed there is a combination of private and public financing, and also of course the debts that people are getting into by accepting these kinds of financial loans, basically?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question, and it's something that we who work in climate finance really consider a lot as well, because not all climate finance is equal, as I had mentioned earlier as well. I think there is a process of seeing things as silver bullets sometimes, and then we get stuck in those ways of doing. So when we look at different instruments, through climate bonds to the new mechanisms that we're developing, they still seem to be entrenched within the same ways of doing and being, which aren't at the moment, they aren't appropriate for what climate finance needs to be addressing. And as was mentioned as well, generally with ODA spending, it goes back to the donor at some stage. So it does have these significant issues that we need to start thinking and unpacking around. How can we think outside the box in terms of delivering innovative sources of finance? What could that be? Of course, grant-based is extremely favorable to climate finance, and it should be what we consider. But at the same time, do we put conditionality around it to ensure those things that you've also already discussed around governance and local needs, to ensure that the finance or the fiscal space that you freed up is actually being used in a manner that towards like resilient climate action, because that's another thing, right? Like how the money is spent. It could be well, one of the concerns actually in the IPCC report as well was that, you know, maladaptation is a thing. We have to think about the quality of actions we take as well. Yeah, so I think that's from my end.
Thank you. Then I would like to go to Professor Khan and maybe also pose this question again. So is it fair to say we would have to decolonize climate finance? And would you even be able to give maybe a specific example on what the experience is within Bangladesh? Have you already experienced any kind of climate financing which would fall under this neo-colonial way of financing climate action?
Okay, thank you. In fact, in Bangladesh, let me mention that 75% of the investments for climate action comes from domestic sources, 75 to 80%. So about 20% we get from international sources. Bangladesh government invests about $2.5 billion a year for addressing climate change in Bangladesh, because Netherlands, your country, knows our country very, very well. We are a very low-lying country, but your country is rich, so you could already adopt. Bangladesh is viewed as kind of a model of disaster management historically because of our ability to mobilize at massive scale community mobilization. That is why, for example, in Amphan or in Cedar, we did not have many casualties, life casualties, but Germany witnessed a death toll of about more than about 200, despite having their so developed economy with many times better infrastructures. So, and in adaptation also, we are trying to do well. Netherlands government has assisted us in developing the Bangladesh Delta Plan 2100. So it's a very, very long-term agenda. And under that also we have about out of 34 projects are directly climate change related. And in Bangladesh we have one problem in the sense which is manifest in most of the developing countries, that our system is a little centralized. That is where effectiveness of adaptation, you know, is not much there in the sense of the investments that we are making, because it is we are having still a top-down approach, not the bottom-up, not the vulnerable communities setting the kind of conditions, priorities, and all those. And also gender inequality we have. In many respects, we have gender equality, for example, in schooling, school enrollment. In terms of implementation of climate finance or adaptation projects, we still don't have this gender parity or bigger role for gender. This is where we need to focus on. And we all know Bangladesh has established a climate change trust fund with its own money. And we are not much expecting now, because Bangladesh is graduating out of the LDC status in next 3-4 years. Already 1-2 steps we have gone over, and in by 24 we will be finally graduating into a middle income country. So our grant part will go down. In fact, in the development aid also grant part will go down, and that is for right reason. I personally don't believe much in grant or doling out, but in terms of adaptation for the LDC country, we must have grants for adaptation, because adaptation is largely a public goods nature. And in developed countries, even public goods are provided by public money, mostly by public money. So why this adaptation, for example, to be provided by private sector? How can we expect that? Private sector is after profit. But as your Netherlands, you friend from Netherlands, you have mentioned that leveraging private sector through public money is something of a good approach. So their mitigation may fit for loans, for example, where it can instantly bring in some income, some profit. But adaptation does not bring in immediate returns because they are, as I mentioned, largely a public goods nature. And that is why it is rarely bankable, at least in the immediate terms. That is why there's a majority share of adaptation finance as loan is absolute injustice. And we need to change this kind of trend globally through negotiation. Let us look at, I'm expecting that COP27 will make a difference in the sense of having more adaptation finance, doubling of adaptation finance that has been committed in Glasgow. And I think the quality of that money also will be better in terms of accessing, in terms of distribution down to the local community level. So this is my ideas.
I might have one follow-up question based on what you said, also on gender equality being still something that is worked on, but also with accessibility to funding. So with the money that is available right now, whether it is for adaptation or mitigation, could you maybe elaborate on how that reaches the communities, if that reaches one? Because I think at the beginning you also say a very small percentage really reaches the local level, and how does it really reach the women whom are most impacted? Is there a system? Are there lessons to be learned? Maybe also looking at Bangladesh specifically?
Yeah, in fact, this devolution of climate finance down to the local level cannot be done by the national government alone, because these developing countries and the LDCs, low-income countries, depend mostly on international support. So both the development partners as well as the national governments, because intergovernmental system, UN system is intergovernmental. Development partners cannot bypass the national governments. So if at the global and at the national level, they come to an understanding that it is the women. In fact, I call women as better husbands than these so-called husbands, because the literal meaning of husband is caretaker. As a non-native English speaker, I think the word husband came from the word husbandry, which means taking care of. And a husband means caretaker. And globally, Grameen Bank, for example, or BRAC, has become the largest NGO in the world, or Grameen Bank as a model, only because of the good behavior of the rural women, for example. Initially, money was given to husbands, but they returned up that loan and never paid back. So women are more responsible globally. That has been shown. And in Bangladesh, we can see that BRAC, success of BRAC or NGO. Now, this challenge is how to reach them. Globally, for example, Adaptation Fund or the GCA, Green Climate Fund, have initiated this expedited direct access facility, and they are having some pilots of $20 million each. And under those programs and projects, there is an establishing local level funds. So one way of reaching out to the poorest communities and the women who are the front line of vulnerability is to kind of establish dedicated funds for the purpose at local levels. And development partners and national government together can do that. But development partners have to be very, very active about that, because they have to put pressure sometimes on for positive reasons, because neocolonialism, yes, for many negative reasons, but there are this kind of development pressure can be also put for positive purposes. So if that happens, then I think the developing country governments will respond better.
Thank you very much. Then I would like to come back to the Netherlands here and ask Verko a very specific question about the Dutch money. So you did the research on what did we fund, where did we go to? Can you maybe elaborate a little bit on that? So where are you able to say whether it reached the most vulnerable people or the women when it comes to looking at the funds the Netherlands has been allocating?
Yeah. So we looked at it in two steps. The easy step was to look at what countries did it go, and then the results were okay because there was a fair share going really to low-income countries. And there was also a relatively good share going to adaptation. But then when you looked at the project documents, evaluation, to see whether the most vulnerable people or women or whatever specific group were reached, we found very little information. I was a bit disappointed. Now we are also doing some field studies. So we visited Bangladesh and Mozambique, and we'll visit a third country later on this year. That's where we found a little bit more information. And for example, where I was in Mozambique now, in the Beira area, also a delta which had cyclones and flood problems, there's a bit of a dilemma there. If you work with the municipality of Beira, they're really trying their best, but they invest more in the formal area because that's where also the tax revenue comes from. I can understand that. But the informal area, let's say slums, there's not so much investment in there. And yeah, this is an issue. We need to sort of sort this out with the Dutch embassy there, with the project implementers. How do we work in such a way that for the municipality is good, that they can get the revenue, and at the same time that we sufficiently reach also the more vulnerable and poorer people. Yeah.
So can I be as brutal as saying they're not being reached at this moment? Also with your example of the slums not being the parts where there is being developed, while you might say they are the ones that might need it most.
Well, they're not. We are not reaching the most vulnerable sufficiently. There are also activities, again, for this Beira, for example. There's some joint work now going on, World Bank, Germans, KV, and the Netherlands, for sort of dikes and drainage that actually serves the whole city, also these slums. So it's not that they're not being reached at all, but they get relatively less attention. Yes.
Yeah. Maybe I would like to go to Sindra to see whether you have any reflections on a little bit following up on this, on whether the money already available. So we have talked about, is there sufficient? Is there already, how can we make sure there comes a loss and damage facility? But can you reflect maybe on the available funds? Are they already being used in a way that is effective and reaching the most vulnerable people? How do you see that? And also, what work is there maybe still to be done to make sure that even if we just said we pledged 100 million a year, is it even being accessed by the ones that we need to access these kinds of funds? Or what is your reflection on that and your experience?
I think, okay, so from my background is also, I've done some work with multilateral development banks as well. And from there, this issue of access to the most vulnerable is something that is really pertinent, because generally and I'm not claiming to be like the expert on this entirely. So if anyone else contributes and corrects me, that's totally fine. But for multilateral development banks and some UN agencies, I think they're unable to perhaps reach the most vulnerable because of the small scale of projects as well, and those generally generate higher transaction costs and aren't seen as bankable. So it becomes like this kind of like a poverty trap, right? So the poorest aren't being reached, and when they are reached, then the quality of finance is not, and this is not like the norm. It may, or it's not necessarily the norm, but it may not be of the quality that is needed locally for local needs. It's not context specific. And Professor Khan had mentioned as well the Grameen model with microinsurance and microloans and grants and stuff like that. And I think these kind of instruments are extremely they're novel, and the collective method of banks is really useful to be able to reach the unbanked and the ones right at the front lines of vulnerability, but they also have issues in them around the social sort of constructs that that you have to navigate when you think about how you construct projects as well. So yeah, I think there's really significant issues that we need to address on how we can reach those on the front lines. And the models at the moment that we have aren't able to do that necessarily, but there are models out there that are able to do that. And that's when you're inclusive of the local context, when you're inclusive of indigenous rights and communities, when you're including them in the process of setting up around their needs as well. Because as you mentioned, Rico, when you're looking at slums as well, they'd be lacking the infrastructure needs as well to be able to identify how you can channel those funds to them. So it's working together to try and maybe even establish those really basic amenities to be able to sort of go from there and develop further.
Thank you. I would like to maybe come back to the Netherlands to the Netherlands. It's as if we're traveling through the world via our digital space, but I'm happy we have that option. We have one question. Of course, I had also mentioned it on your different scenarios which you advised the Dutch government on when it comes to climate finance. An online question came in on what is the most ambitious scenario that you have sketched, and can you maybe elaborate a little bit on that, and how does that fit into the suggestion done by Professor Khan and Sindra online? Can you maybe reflect a little bit on that?
Yeah. Okay, so the recommendations we made in the last chapter of this climate finance study, it didn't talk about loss and damage yet, so I'll have a separate comment on that.
Yeah.
But what we suggested is that under the ambitious scenario, well, we have well, who knows, there should be additional funds on top of the ODA that we were used to. I have no problem with mixing it. So if the agreement is that we should aim for 0.7% ODA, then let's add another 0.1%, or I don't know what amount, to complement that. Because I can see that finance for climate change adaptation and finance for development, let's say in agriculture or water, are also often difficult to disentangle, but the amount should go up. That's one thing. The second thing is that what we do within ODA could become more climate smart. So some already have a climate marker, so they thought about it at least. It could be even better in some cases, but some part of the ODA we don't know. It may have a neutral or perhaps even a negative effect on climate. And my colleague at IAB is now making a sort of climate smartness scale similar to the gender scale. It's like gender blind, gender transformative. So he has established these different levels of how climate smart development aid can be, and he's looking through that lens, but that's still to come out. Third thing is, so we have the special climate finance, we have the ODA that can improve, but the third thing is just policy coherence in general. In Paris, we agreed, this Article 1.2c, to align all financial flows towards climate positive things. And that's where the big money is. If this climate finance is a little bit, ODA is not that much, it's not sufficient. We need to really steer the large amounts, whether it's public expenditure or whether it's the private finance, steer that through regulations or international agreements that should move away from investing in fossil fuel towards more investing in green and climate-friendly practices. That's the biggest challenge.
Yeah, thank you. And you said you would have a remark on loss and damage?
Well, because I know that it is such an issue, it's not just the Netherlands. It's the majority of rich countries, they've sort of taken climate finance out of the ODA, in spite of what people had understood it to be in 2010. But because it was vague, everybody benefited from that somehow. I think this loss and damage is a sort of second chance, a plea again, to come up with additional finance. So I'm not sure how the discussion is going. I know it's very delicate, but I hope so.
Can I maybe give Professor Misan Khan a moment to reflect on these recommendations? Or maybe Sindra, you can start, and then when Professor Khan is available, he can maybe also give some reflections on these recommendations with regards to how ambitious we can be from the Netherlands when it comes to possibly also allocating more funds, of course, because as you have said before, there isn't sufficient funds at this moment.
Yeah, I'm happy to.
Yeah.
Or
Okay,
the-
sure. Sandra, you come in first, then I will.
Okay, I'll be super brief because I think I completely agree with Rico that one of my annoying mantras, I guess, is that all finance should be climate finance. So it's that, you know, like for the systemic transition that we need, for the deep transformation we need, all finance needs to be climate finance. There shouldn't be a thing as climate finance. Everything needs to be aligned. So that's my very short answer.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Professor Khan,
Now let me
go
come in.
ahead. Yes.
Yeah, I agree with the two speakers that, as I mentioned, that particularly adaptation and development cannot be differentiated in most of the cases, though there are standalone, we can have a standalone adaptation projects. But the main point is that the nature and properties of climate finance are different than development aid. So if we can, for example, keep the two parts separate at the mobilization level, and at the implementation level on the ground in a project in Bangladesh, for example, the pot of climate finance and the pot of development aid can be mixed. This is my argument as a negotiator. Otherwise, we cannot track how much climate money is being given by the development partners, because they have legal obligation to provide support, and they agree to do it under language shall provide, both in the convention as well as in the Paris agreement. So this is my one point, but that is not happening. But Netherlands' record is good in that their money goes, a significant share goes for adaptation, unlike many other developed countries. This is one thing. Another thing is, I agree with the idea that we need to kind of enhance the pots, both of ODA, because if you look at since the 1970s, as I mentioned, less than half of 0.7% has been raised. Now about 0.1 or 32%. And there are differences. Netherlands has raised the 0.7% target, as I remember, together with Norway, Luxembourg, and Sweden. Okay. But some other countries, some countries, a major economy gives us less than 0.2%. So we need to enhance the ODA to double it. And then also climate finance. And one, I mentioned the idea that if development partners say we don't have money, that is not right. Lord Nicholas Stern, I'm quoting him, this is not my own word. Lord Nicholas Stern, the writer of Economics of Climate Change, the authoritative author, he mentions that we don't have money is sheer nonsense. It is his words. Look at military spending. About $2 trillion are spent on military budget globally, to address perceived threats. Military security or threats is perceived, not real, but climate change threats are real. For real threats, which has got direct connections with human and global security, we don't have even $100 billion. And there is creative accounting. Though development partners tell that now they have raised $83 billion, but we believe more in Oxfam report. It deflects down that figure 3 to 4 times. So real climate finance is stands at around $20–25 billion a year. So money is available. Look at the stimulus package in developed countries. About $11 trillion could have been mobilized in such a short span of time as a stimulus package. I'm not questioning that they should not mobilize for rescuing own citizens like that. But when developed countries have taken some obligation, they should take care of these, they should comply with their pledge. Because Paris Agreement is a gentleman's agreement. It's bottom up. So there is no sanctioning authority at international level, like the coercive powers at the domestic front. Why international diplomacy does not always function well, because it's intergovernmental and nobody can force. But we believe that in a 21st century world, we must have our national interests on an enlightened track, not pure 4 centuries back, this Westphalian model of sovereignty and sense of political independence. We gain better. The world has become a positive sum game and not a negative sum or zero sum game, that if one wins, then the other must lose. Otherwise, win does not happen. We live in a world of 21st century where more and more problems are becoming global, and we need to solve that through a cooperative way. For example, let me tell, as I mentioned, public goods are provided at national level by public authority mostly. And what is global public good? It's public good, national public good, plus international cooperation. So developed countries, for example, have polluter pays principle. Sweden leads in this, starting from 1990. But other developed countries also apply polluter pays principle within their borders. But for climate change, it's not happening. Why? Because greenhouse gases are stay put. They are posited in a common pot where developed countries have better adaptive capacity, and we don't have that much capacity. And that is why there is less care. But I think enlightened self-interest is what, and that is why I have mentioned that for developed countries, it is the youth generation, young voters who must be much more active, and they should be mobilized. In developing countries, we live in nature and live off the nature in most of the economies. But in developed countries and our democracies are not very mature. But in developed countries, when the voters bulk, then the politicians must listen, and they listen too. That is why in industrial countries, through mobilization, through better education, through education of values education is missing. I had been a student in the Western world for long years. There I didn't see much education focused on ethics and values. That as a citizen, I'm not a citizen of just one country. I have to think in a cosmopolitan manner, with a sense of cosmopolitan justice, cosmopolitan perspective, because we live kind of in a weird world, interdependent, interconnected world. So the citizens also must have kind of mentality, So otherwise, find not much solution if citizen activism, youth activism does not go up. Okay.
Thank you very much. Very valid point. I think one thing I want to touch upon, which Professor Khan mentioned briefly, I don't know if everybody got it out, was that he basically praised the Netherlands on its efforts on adaptation. Can you maybe reflect on that? Is it a fair conclusion of Professor to say that the Netherlands is a champion or is doing quite well on adaptation?
Well, when we looked at other countries, there were some studies done by others, and we compared that study also what we found. There's indeed relatively more Dutch climate finance going to adaptation. So I think the complaint was that maybe not even a quarter of climate finance would go to adaptation, and in our case we come to something a bit more than half.
Yes.
But okay, that also has to do with that we were already working on water and agriculture. So if you can tag a climate finance marker to these activities that you're already doing, it's also quite easy to allocate, to show that a large share of climate finance goes to adaptation. The other thing, and that is a bit particular with Bangladesh, but also with Mozambique, we have quite a long-standing relationship with Bangladesh. So we are a delta country, they're a delta country, and I think for 30 years or so, we have been working together on water management. So yeah, I can be a bit proud of that. Yeah.
We'll accept that.
Sure.
Maybe to say that the time is running out a little bit, and maybe people online or in the physical space would still have some questions. Please feel free to post them physically or online in the chat so I can ask any of the speakers any of your questions. I would also, what came up a little bit in mind as well is also when we're talking about climate finance, is the polluter that has to pay. They are not paying enough. What is there is not getting to the right spaces, the right or the people that need it most. I also want to maybe reflect a little bit on what responsibility we might also see in terms of financing, if any, for the Global South itself. Sindra, would you have maybe a reflection on that, and maybe also the others? So what would be the responsibility or the task for the Global South when talking about climate finance?
Okay, so for the Global South, I think there is, or it's already understood that when you talk about like equity and inequality as well, that there are deep-seated issues not just within developed countries, but in developing countries as well. And that's something that we need to be able to address, to be able to get a grasp of the reality of the situation we're in, right? The compounding crises of that are driven by inequity as well. So thinking about climate, this is a long way of addressing the question because I'm not sure I can address it directly. But in terms of climate finance, then it's in the South, you have to start thinking about the inter-country dynamics and inequality and start addressing that. I'm thinking of countries like India, for example, where the division between the very wealthy and the very poor is extreme, and to be able to have the governance structures in place to be able to have the ability to channel the necessary finance for adaptation measures and for loss and damage, those at the moment may not be there in the manner that they need to be there. So it's looking at the sort of institutional structures as well to be able to address climate finance within the South.
Thank you. Professor Khan, would you have anything to add on it? Also, specifically because in Bangladesh, you talked about having realized already, I don't know the exact name, but a climate fund locally. How do you feel it's the Global South, maybe also responsibility to take part in allocating and mobilizing finances on their own?
Yeah, as I mentioned, 75% of climate money is mobilized domestically. Yeah, we have competing priorities. We are forced to allocate money for addressing climate change because it's the question of our survival. We are a low-lying country at the front line of vulnerability geographically. But vulnerability is a construct, of two phenomena. One is geographical location as a low-lying country and sandwiched between Himalayas in the north and the Bay of Bengal in the south, but also it is also more of socio-economic parameters. Vulnerability emanates from social and economic parameters. If people have access to resources, if people have access to education, then early warning systems and better kind of social capital, which we have in Bangladesh, for example. We have very strong social capital, unlike in many other developing countries. That is where Bangladesh stands out as kind of a model of disaster management. And also we are having progress in adaptation. But our adaptation decision making, as I mentioned, is still centralized. So this needs to be decentralized. And I fully believe that many developing countries have got much more per capita income than the poorest developed countries. So we also have a responsibility, but it is the developed countries which must lead. This is, and this expression is there, both in the Paris Agreement and in the Climate Convention. So if developed countries show the path, then I believe that developing countries will follow also in terms of transparency and accountability. If developed countries show in clear and unequivocal language the delivery of climate finance as they are, then I think that will be kind of a positive pressure on the developing countries to be more accountable and transparent to the citizens. For better governance, they will be forced to, for better governance.
Yeah, thank you very much. Maybe one last question to Ferko before we go to the concluding remarks of all the speakers. So as I hear, of course, we have to pledge as northern countries a certain amount of money. And then, of course, you researched how that got where it got, to which countries. Can you maybe also try to get us from how do we as a country, as the Netherlands, come from we pledge a certain amount of money to actually making sure it gets where it gets? Can you outline for us which steps it goes through a little bit, or give an example of how money that the Netherlands has pledged went to a certain fund and then to the countries, for example?
Yeah, let me see. The agreement was that from 2020 onwards, there would be 100 billion going from richer countries to developed countries for climate finance. And what a colleague of mine, well, not at IOB, but at the ministry did, is to calculate what would be the fair share of the Netherlands. And so they looked at, all these rich countries, the size of their economy, and he calculated somehow that the Netherlands should pay, was it 1.2% of this 100 billion, so 1.2 billion. I know Oxfam Novib recalculated and they came to a slightly higher percentage. But anyway, there was a sort of a way to calculate a fair share. Then they still had some years before 2020 to gradually go there. So they were looking at the portfolios. There are water projects, there are agricultural projects, some were already working on climate, and new projects, they could be designed a bit more climate smart. So, well, if we're going to do something there on drinking water, for example, let's think of what climate change may look like in that area, and should we then not have deeper wells or something like that? So make the normal activities a little bit more climate smart. So that way, the percentage of ODA projects that received a climate marker gradually increased. And that way, yeah, they sort of succeeded in achieving this 1.2 billion a year. Again, there's a nice shadow report of Oxfam Novib who calculates it slightly differently, and then they show, according to them, it's a smaller amount of money.
Yeah, so maybe also the question, because I know, for example, there's this existence of the Dutch fund for climate. So how does money, for example, go through such a fund, and who decides on what kind of fund gets this money, and who allocates it then to the countries or the projects that would fall under such a Dutch fund for climate and development?
Yeah, there were already international climate funds, and maybe it would have been a lot easier to transfer that money directly to these international funds. But anyway, it was decided that the Netherlands would set up its own development fund for climate finance or something. That's being managed by SNV, World Wildlife Funds, and another one. And it has like separate windows for mitigation projects and for adaptation projects. And they have a sort of an origination fund where projects' ideas get some years to be tested. That's purely grants. And from there on, the idea is that they would graduate to a project where gradually more private finance was then included. I think the fund is being fed by 40 million a year, but it's still in the starting phase. I'm sort of half involved, FMO's also managing it, half involved in the monitoring and evaluation, not in the policy.
Yes.
So I'm not really sure how well it's doing. It's a bit of a particular fund that it was a pure Dutch fund of climate finance. I would have preferred it all to go to one of the existing international funds.
Yeah. Maybe that would also be challenging for in terms of accessibility of climate funding, of course, because then now it's again another fund that people have to find and to know that it exists instead of just using the official streams of income. Because we are very short in time and we might have too many questions still, but I do have one specific question that I would also like to ask everyone to maybe in one or two sentences reflect on what can we take to the Dutch delegation as an assignment or maybe a recommendation that we need for them to go and stand for at the COP negotiations this year. Would you have a reflection on that? Maybe let me begin with you.
Yeah, well, an idea that I called also from Professor Khan. I like the idea that you should keep ODA, which is tax money, separate from climate finance, which could come from another source. You could tax carbon emissions, fuel or whatever, electricity, whatever. You could have a different resource other than tax money to have climate finance. And then when it arrives in a country like Bangladesh, okay, there you could actually mix ODA and this, let's say, carbon levy finance that comes from, also from us or from companies, mainly from companies, I guess. There they can mix it in something that makes sense, that combines development and adaptation, for example. So that's an interesting idea I caught today.
Thank you. Maybe Sindra, what would your recommendations be for us as well? Also, that will be part of the negotiations. I'm saying us, that would not be me personally, but ActionAid will definitely be there. What would you recommend for us to take away also from today? And speaking about climate finance and maybe specifically about loss and damage.
I think for loss and damage, the ask is clear. It is to support the need for a loss and damage finance facility and to finally address loss and damage, and also maybe learn from the good examples of Netherlands around having more than balanced adaptation finance and having other countries follow suit in that manner as well.
Thank you. Professor Khan, maybe last but not least, what would you give us as a recommendation to take along to the COP negotiations at the end of this year?
Yeah, my kind of one suggestion will be in one of my articles published 2 years back in 2020 in Climatic Change, where I have quoted a Dutch Foreign Ministry Environment Agency report, which clearly mentioned that global public bets should be penalized to fund global public goods. So climate change is a global public bad, and that has to be penalized. Who causes climate change most? They have to be pay for. It is virtually the polluter pays principle. if we can apply, as we apply in managing solid waste, for example, solid waste dumping is extremely costly, but atmospheric dump is used freely because these gases and air pollution don't stay put. They straddle across borders. That is where we need to have some kind of enlightened self-interest among nations, as I argue. Okay, so adaptation should be regarded as a global public good. This is my suggestion.
Thank you very much. Then I would like to thank all our speakers for joining us today. We really appreciate your wisdom and insights that you have shared with us today. For the people that were here, thank you very much for attending live, but also on the online space. All the webinars will be available online to rewatch. And if you have any questions or would like to get more information on everything our speakers talked about today, you can always reach out to us at ActionAid. This was also the concluding third webinar of our series of climate talks. So you can always watch back the one on climate change and gender equality, but also the one where we addressed how to avoid, mitigate, and address climate change. Thank you all for watching, listening, and we hope to see you soon in other activities we're doing. Thank you very much again to our speakers, and have a great evening all.
Thank you. Thank you.